In the last class, we looked at how we move from a paragraph to an essay. There we observed that the body of an essay can have different organizational patterns or different discourse strategies. So, in the next few lectures, we will look at some important organizational patterns. One among them is narration. So, these are some organizational patterns which are frequently used, which will be of great relevance to us in academic context. So, we will try to look at them in detail in the next few lectures. Today, we will start with narration. So, what is narration? Narration means you talk about something which has happened in detail. So, you talk about an event or a series of incidents which are connected with one another. In academic context, we usually narrate real incidents. We will look at what and other details very soon. Elsewhere, like for example, in creative writing, you can also have imaginary events or sometimes real events as well. Then you give anecdotal evidence to argue for something. You can also use it in research studies. We will look at an example. And narration is also used in biographies and autobiographies. So, this is a technique which is quite popular and which is extensively used. So, a narrative, as I mentioned, is about an incident or several incidents which are linked. Important thing to note here is that there is logical sequence among these events. So, this logical sequence is mostly chronology in the sense. So, according to the time lapse, these things events are arranged. So, you start with the oldest, then you move to the newest. So, a narrative is told by a narrator. So, this narrator may be a direct part of that experience. Sometimes he or she may have just been an observer. So, we will look at different examples to understand these distinctions. The modern narratives have a broader function. Most of these are personal in nature and they do not merely entertain the readers, but they also serve as a means, in fact, a very powerful means to communicate writers' moral, cultural and political perspectives on a particular issue. So, you may have seen many documentaries adopting this narration technique. This kind of lends a personal touch and also makes it a little more interesting. Many classroom and on the job writing occasions call for the use of this narrative technique. For example, a scientist narrates how a particular research project came along. So, how it started, what was the reason, and then what are the ups and downs and so on. For example, a department manager sometimes prepares what we call a work history of a worker. So, the service record of an employer. Then supervisors narrate development of a product. So, there are many occasions where we use this technique. Now, coming to the purpose. So, what could be the purpose of a narrative? Of course, the first one is simply to tell what happened. Say for example, if somebody asks you, what did you do yesterday? So, you just tell them, I went to watch a movie, or then we had food outside, and so on. You are just simply telling what happened. Then you might also use this to establish an interesting or useful fact. So, you narrate something, then on the basis of that you say, okay, this proves this, or because of this something I realized. So, that kind of purpose could also exist. Then delve into underlying motives. So, you are analyzing a person's character, say for example. So, how this person behaved in a particular event or in an incident might throw light on that person's character or underlying motives. Then offer lessons and insights. So, particularly personal narrative. So, what was my mistake and what I learned from it, say for example. So, you have learned some insights, you have learned a lesson based on some incidents. So, then you talk about that incident and how it brought in some new insights. So, that is why a narrative can serve multiple purposes. Action. So, if you look at key ingredients of a good narrative, the first one is action. So, it plays a very important role in any narrative. So, other writing often suggests action and lets readers to imagine it for themselves, but narration does it so powerfully, it actually walks the readers through that particular action packed sequence of events. So, readers you can say relive those moments. So, therefore, action here is very important. You have to give lot of attention to details and do not leave out anything. Next is conflict. So, conflict here not necessarily something between two persons, some kind of a physical fight, it is not necessary. So, here conflict, it could be within oneself, between two contradictory ideologies or two different thoughts, say, or it could also be conflict at the thought level between two individuals, and the narrative actually tells what was the reason for this and how it progressed, how it ended, and what is the significance of that. So, this conflict can actually add to action, and we have discussed the purposes. It can tell something about the characters of people involved in it. Point of view. We mentioned that narration is done by a person, and this person is called narrator. So, who this person is, depending on that, we usually identify first person point of view or third person point of view. So, what is the difference? First person point of view, let us look at this sample text. We would go to the well and wash in the ice cold clear water, grease our legs with equally cold stiff Vaseline, then tiptoe into the house. We wipe the dust from our toes and settle down for schoolwork, cornbread, clabbered milk, prayers and bed, always in that order. So, this is from Mama's Encounter, written by Maya Angelou. So, here you can see the use of the pronoun we. So, the person who is narrating this was in fact a part of that event. So, it is first hand experience of the narrator. So, this is we say first person point of view. I have gone through something, I have experienced something, so I am narrating. So, usually you see the use of pronouns I, we, us, something like that. So, this is first person point of view. Look at another example here. Dr. Watson, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, said Stamford, introducing us. How are you? He said cordially, gripping my hand with a strength for which I should hardly have given him credit. You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive. How on earth did you know that? I asked in astonishment. Never mind, said he, chuckling to himself. So, this is from Watson in a Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So, here the narrator is actually Dr. Watson. However, you can see the difference between this narrative and this one. Here, the narrator is the protagonist as well, the central character as well. However, here we know that the central character, the protagonist is Sherlock Holmes, but it is narrated by Dr. Watson. So, this is the first person point of view, but the narrator is not the protagonist. Next is third person point of view. So, here again we usually distinguish between two things, third person omniscient and third person limited. Let us look at an example. When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, the former, who had been cautious in her praise of Mr. Bingley before, expressed to her sister how very much she admired him. He is just what a young man ought to be, said she, sensible, good humoured, lively, and I never saw such happy manners, so much ease, with such perfect good breeding. He is also handsome, replied Elizabeth, which a young man ought likewise to be, if he possibly can. His character is thereby complete. So, this is from Pride and Prejudice. So, here this is about Jane and Elizabeth, and this whole incident is reported by a third person, as if that third person were watching the entire thing right before him or her and now narrating it for the readers. This we call third person omniscient, means the narrator knows about everything, what the characters talk about, even what they are thinking, their inner emotions, everything, they have access to it and they report it to the reader. So, this is third person omniscient. Here you can see, so when Jane and Elizabeth were alone, so the narrator knows they were alone, and earlier she had been very cautious in her praise of Mr. Bingley. So, all these things the narrator has access to. In contrast, if it is third person limited, it is like the narrator narrates things only which he or she has seen or has known. So, the inner thoughts of the characters here may not be known to the narrator, and hence they are not revealed to the readers. So, this is the difference between third person omniscient and third person limited. There is also second person narrative, which is not very frequently used. Okay. Moving on, key events. So, if you have a narration, if you have an incident, so there must be some important events. You are planning to write your narrative, then you need to zero in on key events. So, these key events, these are directly connected to your purpose. So, that is very important. What is the purpose of your narrative? So, accordingly, the events you choose must be linked to that particular purpose. Otherwise, whatever you are trying to achieve through your narrative may not happen. Of course, you also have few secondary events to keep narrative flowing smoothly, but you do not give too much details. You just maintain them at very sketchy level. For example, you went and watched a movie and you had a wonderful experience at theater, let us say. So, that is your key event. You are watching a movie and you are enjoying it. Of course, you also did several other things, something like starting off from your home, then reaching the theater, buying tickets, buying food and so on. So, these all things will be secondary events. So, you mention them in a very sketchy manner and you move to your key event. So, if you focus only on the key event, recall one of the principles of a good narrative we noted in the very beginning, the logical sequence goes missing. So, in order to maintain that, you bring in few secondary events, but you keep them very sketchy. Another important aspect of a narrative is dialogue. So, what is the purpose of dialogues in a narrative? First, these dialogues make any narrative very interesting, then it resembles real life conversation. Note, you are reporting something what has already happened. So, you are sort of recreating it. So, if you have dialogues, it closely resembles real life situations. Then you in the dialogue you have short words, simple sentences. So, this makes it for readers very entertaining and very interesting. It also breaks the monotony of longish text. So, when we look at a text, then we will analyze the role of a dialogue more closely. So, coming to academic context particularly, so what is the role of the narrative? So, you may have essays based on personal experiences. So, your instructor may ask you, or sometimes in exams these questions appear. For example, let us look at this: narrate an experience which changed your views about a person or an ideology. So, if you look at this, this talks about how your views about a person or an ideology changed, and that change was triggered by a particular incident, one particular experience. So, the question asks you to narrate it. Say for example, you had some views about your parents, like they were very strict, they were not letting you do whatever you wanted and so on. This was your opinion, and then an incident happened. Say they organized a surprise birthday party and that made you change your views about your parents, something like that. So, this was a very simple example which I just gave you, but in interviews and in exams you can also make it fairly complex. For example, how something changed your views about a person, an ideology. So, then it becomes a complex narrative. Then expanding a proverb or a maxim. Let us look at an example. Sometimes actions can have unintended consequences. Expand the statement using personal example. So, there is a here you can say a saying or a maxim. Sometimes actions can have unintended consequences. You do something and you hope it will result in something good, but unexpectedly something bad happens, something which you did not want to happen, so happens. So, this question asks you to explain this with examples and particularly personal examples. So, from your personal life. We will look at an example, then this becomes clear. Then you can also talk about your research procedure methodology, particularly qualitative research. You can narrate how you set up a lab, or you can narrate experiences of working on a project, your personal experience of working with colleagues, working in a team. So, these things you can narrate. So, now we will look at an example. So, this is sometimes good intentions can have bad consequences. This narration is taken from Defending the Free Market, written by Serico. So, let us look at this extract. When I was in seminary, my classmates and I ran a soup kitchen in a low income part of DC. The poor didn't have to clean or help set up, they could just come, eat and leave. One day I realized an unintended consequence of our generous actions. Since they didn't require anything from their guests, people were coming from all over to get a free meal. As a result, a local fish and chips restaurant was losing all of its customers. Here was a family trying to run a small business, and we were this family's competition. There is a better way to do charity. My solution was to require attendees of the soup kitchen to help clean up. This weeded out those who were coming simply for the free food. So, this is the saying, and this particular incident explains this, supports this. So, it is in first person narrative. So, you can see the use of pronoun I. So, the narrator was he involved in this? Yes, if you read it, then it becomes clear. So, it is a personal experience. So, what exactly happened? So, when the narrator and his friends, they were in seminary, they ran a soup kitchen in a low income part. The idea was to help the poor who did not have food. People could just come and eat, they did not have to clean or do any kind of voluntary service there. So, they started this with good intention, but later on they realized this good intention had a bad consequence. So, what was that? People were coming from all over to get a free meal, and as a result a local restaurant was losing its customers. So, this was the moment of realization, and then what did the narrator do? Narrator came up with a solution. They asked attendees of the soup kitchen to help clean up. So, as a result, those who were coming just for the free food, they stopped. So, this short extract tells us how sometimes good intention can have bad consequence. You can see that it is in a logical sequence, starting from the oldest, then moving on in the time scale. Then there are lots of key events So, the narrator setting up a thing, then the consequence and the solution they came up with. So, this is how you use your personal experiences to expand a saying, a proverb, something like this. Okay. We will look at now another example. So, this is you can say history of a product. So, what is this? This is history of jeans. Let us look at it. Levi Strauss, an enterprising immigrant who had some blue denim cloth with him, recognized the need for strong work pants in the mining communities of California. He first designed and marketed Levi's in 1850, and they have stayed essentially the same ever since, except for a few minor alterations. The original Levi's did not contain rivets. Jacob Davis, a tailor, invented riveted pants at the request of a miner who complained that regular pants were not rugged enough to hold his mining tools. Davis subsequently granted Strauss the use of his rivet idea, which was patented on 20th May 1873. A few other changes were made over the next century. Zippers replaced buttons in 1920. In 1937, the rivets on the back pockets were moved inside in response to complaints from school boards that the jeans students wore were damaging chairs. So, this basically talks about how this product jeans developed over a number of years. So, this is different from the example which we saw earlier. This was a personal narrative. So, the information has come from you. So, you think about it, you brainstorm, and the details are there. Here you have consulted different resources, and you have synthesized information to narrate how jeans as a product developed. We will now look at an example of an anecdote in a research study. This is called "Dictionaries are Unpredictable." The researcher here is Amritavalli. This is about how sometimes children find dictionaries useless to find meaning of a new word. So, let us look at an extract from this research study. We begin with a narrative of a close encounter between two students and two dictionaries. Srinu, a boy, and Nagamani, a girl, have passed the 10th class from an AP residential school. Both have a good record of academic achievement, including in English, although their command of the language is far from perfect, and they are keen to work on improving their skills. As an ELT knowing well-wisher, I have volunteered to help them during the weeks they are free between leaving school and starting at college. Srinu and Nagamani are trying to read and understand on their own a short 500-word feature on water pumps in the Hindu's young world. Srinu is figuring out the sentence, "Nowadays water supply from the municipalities, corporations and water boards has become erratic and unpredictable." He looks up the word unpredictable in one of the two dictionaries I have taken into class for the students to use, the Collins Cobild Essential English Dictionary, Sinclair 1988. So, here you can see that the researcher narrates her experience, how she was working with two students and how these students were trying to figure out the meaning of the word unpredictable, as it has been used in a particular sentence they have found in an article. And then the study goes on to talk about the difficulties students faced, and then it goes on to discuss issues with dictionaries in general. So, this is how you can use a narrative in a research study as well. So, as we observed earlier, the order in which the events are presented in the narrative is very important for the overall unity. If the order is not appropriate, the meaning may change. Let us look at these two sentences. These are just two short sentences, just for the purposes of illustration. Look at these examples. The car hit the divider, it rolled over. The car rolled over, it hit the divider. So, without any linker, without any other clue. Now, if you just look at it, so what is the meaning you get? The first set, the car hit the divider, it rolled over. So, you assume that car hitting the divider was the first incident, and probably as a result of that it rolled over. Now, the same sentences, you have changed the order, the car rolled over, it hit the divider. Now, which was the first incident? Car rolling over was the first, then it hit the divider. So, the meaning here changes. So, the order of the events presented is very crucial. So, in order to establish a clear order among events, we use several linkers and transition words. Some are listed here: after, afterwards, before, during, earlier, eventually, first, in the meantime, later, meanwhile, next, now, once, second, soon, sooner, then, today, until, when, and so on. So, these linkers, which are particularly related to time, are very crucial in a narrative. We will now look at a longish narrative and understand features of a narrative. This is called the perfect picture, written by James Alexander Thom. Let us read this in detail first. It was early in the spring, about 15 years ago, a day of pale sunlight and trees just beginning to bud. I was a young police reporter driving to a scene I didn't want to see. A man, the police dispatcher's broadcast said, had accidentally backed his pickup truck over his baby granddaughter in the driveway of the family home. It was a fatality. As I parked among police cars and TV news cruisers, I saw a stocky white-haired man in cotton work clothes standing near a pickup. Cameras were trained on him and reporters were sticking microphones in his face. Looking totally bewildered, he was trying to answer their questions. Mostly, he was only moving his lips, blinking and choking up. After a while, the reporters gave up on him and followed the police into the small white house. I can still see in my mind's eye that devastated old man looking down at the place in the driveway where the child had been. Beside the house was a freshly spaded flower bed and nearby a pile of dark, rich earth. I was just backing up there to spread the good dirt, he said to me, though I had not asked him anything. I didn't even know she was outdoors. He stretched his hand toward the flower bed, then let it flop to his side. He lapsed back into his thoughts, and I, like a good reporter, went into the house to find someone who could provide a recent photo of the toddler. A few minutes later, with all the details in my notebook and a 3x5 studio portrait of the cherubic child tucked in my jacket pocket, I went toward the kitchen where the police had said the body was. I had brought a camera in with me, the big bulky speed graphic, which used to be the newspaper reporter's trademark. Everybody had drifted back out of the house together: family, police, reporters and photographers. Entering the kitchen, I came upon this scene. On a formica top table, backlighted by a frilly curtained window, lay the tiny body, wrapped in a clean white sheet. Somehow the grandfather had managed to stay away from the crowd. He was sitting on a chair beside the table, in profile to me and unaware of my presence, looking uncomprehendingly at the swaddled corpse. The house was very quiet. A clock ticked. As I watched, the grandfather slowly leaned forward, curved his arms like parentheses around the head and feet of the little form, then pressed his face to the shroud and remained motionless. In that hushed moment, I recognized the makings of a prize-winning news photograph. I appraised the light, adjusted the lens setting and distance, locked a bulb in the flash gun, raised the camera and composed the scene in the viewfinder. Every element of the picture was perfect. The grandfather in his plain work clothes, his white hair backlit by sunshine, the child's form wrapped in the sheet, the atmosphere of the simple home suggested by black iron trivets and World's Fair souvenir plates on the walls flanking the window. Outside, the police could be seen inspecting the fatal rear wheel of the pickup while the child's mother and father leaned in each other's arms. I don't know how many seconds I stood there, unable to snap that shutter. I was keenly aware of the powerful storytelling value that photo would have, and my professional conscience told me to take it. Yet, I couldn't make my hand fire that flash bulb and intrude on the poor man's island of grief. At length, I lowered the camera and crept away, shaken with doubt about my suitability for the journalistic profession. Of course, I never told the city editor or any fellow reporters about that missed opportunity for a perfect news picture. Every day on the newscasts and in the papers, we see pictures of people in extreme conditions of grief and despair. Human suffering has become a spectator sport, and sometimes as I am watching news film, I remember that day. I still feel right about what I did. So, if you look at this narrative, in the very first paragraph, it gives details about what, where and who are the people involved in this. So, this is first person narrative. You can see I here. So, is the narrator involved in the action? Yes, we see that when we read it in detail. So, who is the narrative? Narrative is a young police reporter. And where is he? He has gone to an accident scene. So, what is the situation there? A man, later on we come to know that an old man has accidentally killed his granddaughter while backing up his truck. The grandfather was working in the family garden, and this sentence, it was a fatality. It tells us that the poor toddler unfortunately died in that accident. So, this is the scene. So, here the narrator as a police reporter talks about what he did there, and in particular about his dilemma whether to take photograph of the grandfather or not. So, you can see the events are neatly arranged. So, the narrator reaching there, then some details about the grandfather, then you can see here some dialogues here. So, this is very crucial here. So, if you look at the use of dialogues here, I was just packing up there to spread the good out. He said to me, though I had not asked him anything, I did not even know she was outdoors. So, this very powerfully shows the emotions of the grandfather here, and in order to set it out, probably the writer here has used dialogues. Then so a few minutes later, so this is in a chronological fashion. So, what the writer first saw when he reached there, then few minutes have elapsed, and then what is happening. Okay. Then the writer has a camera and he wanted to take a photograph. So, which scene? So, here is the thing, I came upon this scene. There is in the kitchen, grandfather is there with the body of the toddler, and the grandfather slowly leaned forward, curved his arms like parentheses around the head and feet of the little form. So, see, this refers to the body of the toddler. Then pressed his face to the shroud and remained motionless. So, this the writer, the narrator recognized as one moment, which could lead to a prize winning news photograph, because it captured all the emotions of the grandfather, then everything else was also here most appropriate. But then did the narrator manage to take that photograph? If you continue in the narrative, you then realize I did not know how many seconds I stood there unable to snap that shutter. So, the narrator was not able to do it. Why? He thought that would be intruding on the poor man's island of grief. So, he lowered the camera and crept away. So, now here the question is, so what is the narrator's purpose in narrating this particular incident? So, are there any insights the narrator has drawn, or is the narrator trying to make a point here? You can see here there is conflict in him between professional conscience and humane values. So, one part of him probably said, you are a professional photographer, so you have to go ahead with your work. But as a human being, he thought that is simply not right. The grandfather was suffering, and taking a photograph would intrude on him, would be an intrusion into that poor man's private space. So, this conflict the writer was able to resolve, and finally, he decided not to take that photograph. So, this is the incident. If you come to the last paragraph, the narrator here links that incident with the present. So, every day on the newscasts and in the newspapers, we see pictures of people in extreme conditions of grief and despair. Human suffering has become a spectator sport. So, here the writer is referring to commercialization of things. So, if somebody is being beaten, or even somebody has met with an accident, people rush there to take photographs of it and post, rather than to help the person there. So, and ends with this single sentence. See, it stands alone, because this brings in all the impact. I still feel right about what I did. So, writer is very clear, he is not regretting about his decision. So, this is how you can use a personal narrative to throw light on inner conflict, and then the final decision you made, and the insights you drawn from that particular incident. Okay. So, moving on, when you have to plan and draft a narrative, what things do you need to keep in mind? Most assignments require you to narrate personal experiences. So, we have seen some examples, maybe in exams or even interviews, there are questions about your personal experiences. So, first person narrative is suitable here. If you are going to tell about somebody else, then you can use third person. Then you can pick an experience that illustrates some point. You have to be here very careful. You have to very carefully choose an incident which you think is very effective in making the point you are trying to do. So, for example, we saw an example earlier how something changed your views about a person or an ideology, something. So, there may be several incidents in your life. So, you have to ask yourself which of those has enough information, which of those has key events which I can use to make my point. So, you have to pick an experience that is most appropriate for your purpose. For example, you narrate only about how you violated a friend's confidence and you stop there. Say your friend had trusted in you and you failed. Say he had given you some money without interest and you then say you never borrowed any money from him. So, if you just stop there, it does not make a very strong point. So, you continue and then you say how you gained insight into say obligations of friendship, then it becomes more effective. Say in that case your friend said, okay, let it go, I do not want our friendship to die because of this money, then that has made you realize actually the value of friendship, then your narrative is making a very strong point. So, use your personal experiences very carefully. So, what experience in my life or that of someone I know would be worth narrating? This is very important. What point does this experience illustrate? So, once you have zeroed in on a particular experience, then you ask yourself who were involved, what role did they play, what were the key events and other things. Say you have to narrate about something else, not based on your personal experiences, then you need to synthesize information from different sources. For example, a historian writing a biography refers to public documents, newspaper reports, diaries, letters, etc., in order to create a balanced write-up. So, once you have identified sources, you have information, you reflect on them and then establish your own connections and then decide how you can use these things to make a very effective write-up. Say for example, you are writing a biography about the famous Hindustani classical singer Bhimsen Joshi. So, how he left his home, travelled on train, sang and now with the little money he made, he travelled from place to place, then found somebody as his guru, but that person asked him to go back to his place and so on. So, you have collected the information. So, next task is to narrate it in an interesting way. So, recall our discussion about important ingredients. So, you have action, arranging key events in a logical sequence, then using dialogues judiciously. So, all these things will make your narrative very effective. So, how can you start a narrative? So, you usually set the stage for what follows. We saw the example there in the perfect picture. So, details like who the narrator is and where the narrator was. So, all these details and the important information that the grandfather had run over the toddler unexpectedly, all these things are given in the very beginning. So, when, where and what action, all these details are given. So, these all would be background to the incident. Then you can also state your main point. In that incident, the writer states the main point towards the end, but you can state it in the very beginning. Recall our discussion of a structure of a usual essay. So, the first paragraph includes your thesis statement. So, in a narrative, this would be your main point, your main purpose, the insight you drawn or the conflict you resolved, something. So, that would be in the very first paragraph. So, there are various ways, and one of the easiest is to use 5 W's according to some people: who, what, where, when, why. So, these ensure that the reader can understand what you have written if you give details of these. Who should clearly introduce the character? Is this an adult, child? So, then what introduces your event to the reader? Where helps establish the mood and atmosphere for the setting of the event you are retelling? When expands on the time the event took place? Why is a brief explanation of the circumstances leading up to the event? So, these things make up basic narrative. Body, here it moves the action till the turning point. So, in the narrative we saw the perfect picture, the writer entering the house, observing things, observing the grandfather, then deciding that it is going to be the perfect picture, but then deciding not to take the photograph. So, all these, the action moves, and where the writer decides not to take the photograph, it is actually the turning point. So, there are several key events, and the body is built around them. So, you can use conflict as the writer has used in the example we saw. You can also use dialogue to heighten the interest. Conclusion, you tie up any loose ends, you settle any unresolved conflicts. So, in the previous example, writer comes back to the present, links what had happened in his life sometime back in the past with the events in the present, and shows that the experiences are still very relevant. Sometimes you may introduce a surprise twist. For example, O. Henry's stories, if you recall, there is usually a sudden twist at the end. The most common method for ending a narrative paragraph is to refer back to your topic sentence and by rephrasing it. For example, if your thesis statement in the beginning is something like this: appearances can be deceptive, you can rephrase it like, that is how I learned that the outside does not always reflect the inside. There are some ethical issues, particularly if you are narrating incidents from somebody else's life. So, have I provided a truthful account that participants will recognize and accept? So, if it is a historical figure, a famous personality, you cannot distort facts. Would the narrative damage reputation of somebody or expose them to danger? do I need to change names? Say you are narrating something about war, terrorism, then these issues you need to keep in mind. Or sometimes court cases, there again you need to change names to protect the identities of people involved. Does the narrative encourage unethical or illegal behavior? So, say you are narrating an incident which ultimately tells you that smoking is good. So, that is definitely unethical practice. You cannot narrate an incident on such issues. Revising, once you have written it, the final step is to revise it. So, have I made the point that I intended? Does all of the action relate to the main point? It is again very important. So, no digressions. Remember, keep the secondary events, but very sketchy level. Is the conflict handled properly? Have I included all of the key events that relate to my purpose? Have I given each one right emphasis? So, accordingly you can change the relative importance you have given to these points. Now, here is a task for you. There are 3 questions. You can develop a narrative on these. I will discuss each of these very briefly. So, the first one, narrate an incident in which you demonstrated your leadership skills. So, this kind of question usually comes in interviews. So, the person who is interviewing you wants to know when you demonstrated your leadership skills. So, here you have to very clearly narrate an incident. Say you organized a college cultural fest, you were in charge of say food. So, how you managed it. So, you have to give detailed account. So, this is based on personal experience. Narrate an experience that taught you an important lesson about human nature. So, several incidents may have happened in your life which were quite shocking to you, which were revealing. So, out of those you choose the most effective one and then you narrate it how you learned something about human nature. Like people may be greedy, but there is still sympathy, kindness among them and so on maybe. So, this it could be from your own personal life or something from others you have witnessed very closely. Final one, do not judge a book by its cover. Explain this proverb using personal experiences. So, here is a proverb. So, first in such a question you need to understand the proverb very carefully. So, what does this mean? Do not judge a book by its cover. So, you have something, do not judge something only by its external appearances, maybe an object or even a person. So, explain this using personal experiences. So, maybe you have misjudged somebody just on the basis of his or her external appearances and then you regretted it, or a tool or object which you thought would be useless first, but then you realized its potential worth. So, those kind of experiences you can include here. So, today we have looked at one of the important organizational patterns, that is narrative. We saw that key ingredients of a good narrative are key events, action, dialogues and logical sequence. All these brought together for a definitive purpose. So, thank you.